He walked a crying girl home in the rain, unaware she was a millionaire, escaping an arranged marriage. The rain came down in relentless sheets, swallowing the city in a curtain of water and wind. Streetlights flickered against the storm, and puddles stretched across the sidewalks like mirrors of chaos. David Carter hunched his shoulders beneath the weight of his hooded jacket as he walked briskly home from his late shift at the public library. His bag, filled with overdue paperwork and an umbrella that had already broken halfway through the walk, thumped against his hip with each step. He had just passed the intersection of 5th and Halston when a sound cut through the storm, a scream, sharp and full of panic. He froze. It came again. High-pitched, desperate. A woman. Without a second thought, David turned down a narrow alley. The rain blurred his vision, but he could just make out a figure stumbling in the distance. A woman, young, soaked, disoriented. Her coat was torn at the sleeve, hair matted to her face, and she was running. Behind her, 2 men in dark suits surged forward, their movements stiff and purposeful. "Stop!" one of them shouted. "Get away from me!" she cried, breath ragged, feet splashing through puddles. David's instincts kicked in. He stepped into the alley's mouth, blocking her path. "Hey!" he yelled. "What's going on?" The woman slammed into him, nearly falling, her fingers gripping his coat in terror. "Please!" she gasped, eyes wide with fear. "Don't let them take me!" The suited men slowed their pace, approaching cautiously. "This doesn't concern you," one of them said coolly. "Family matter. Step aside." David's eyes flicked between the woman and the 2 men. She was trembling, lips blue from the cold, eyes full of something more than fear, desperation. He squared his shoulders. "I don't know who you think you are, but I'm not letting you drag her off into the night." "Sir," the second man warned, reaching into his coat, "you're interfering in something you don't understand." That was enough. David grabbed the woman's hand and turned. "Run!" They bolted. Rain slapped their faces as they tore through the alleyways. David's mind raced as fast as his feet. He took every turn he remembered from growing up in this neighborhood. The shortcut behind the bakery, the wooden fence behind the old record shop. The men were close behind, panting. David yanked the girl into a narrow service stairwell beside an abandoned bookstore. She stumbled, clutching his shoulder, her breath shaky. "This way," he urged. They squeezed through a broken metal door and into a darkened storeroom. It smelled of damp wood and dust. David pulled the door shut behind them just as footsteps thundered past outside. He crouched, catching his breath. She leaned against the wall, shivering. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. I don't think so." David took off his soaked jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "I'm David," he said. "You don't have to tell me anything, but I need to get you somewhere safe." "I know a place," she murmured. "It's not far." They waited until the footsteps faded, then slipped out the back. Emma led the way through a maze of alleys to a run-down laundromat with a flickering neon sign. She unlocked a side door with a small key she pulled from her boot. The warmth inside was almost startling. She guided him to a cramped storage room in the back with a cot, a desk, and a small heater humming quietly. "This is where you've been staying?" he asked. She nodded, brushing wet hair from her face. "Temporary," she whispered. He wanted to ask questions. Who were those men? Why were they chasing her? What was she running from? But he didn't. Something in her expression told him she had been answering questions her whole life. Instead, he handed her a towel from the corner shelf and knelt by the heater. "Do you have a name?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then met his gaze. "Emma." He recognized it. Lancaster. The same name on newspapers and real estate towers, but he said nothing. "Emma," he repeated softly. "You're safe now." She looked at him like she wanted to believe it, and for the first time that night, she let herself breathe. The rain had finally stopped by morning, leaving the streets washed clean and glittering beneath the early light. In the back room of the laundromat, the air was still damp, but the heater hummed gently as Emma stirred a pot of oatmeal on a small electric stove. David entered, rubbing the back of his neck, freshly showered from the staff locker room at the library across the street. He paused when he saw her. "You didn't have to cook," he said. Emma glanced over her shoulder and gave a small smile. You let me stay. I wanted to help." He studied her for a moment, barefoot, sleeves rolled up, face soft in the morning light. She looked like someone who belonged, and yet she looked like someone who had never belonged anywhere. They ate in silence, not uncomfortable, just quiet. Afterward, she insisted on cleaning. David had never seen his shelves so organized, his books alphabetized, his mismatched mugs lined up like soldiers. She found a rag and started dusting places he had long since forgotten existed. "Are you always this thorough?" he teased. Emma gave a half laugh. "It helps me think." He didn't press. That was the unspoken agreement between them. He didn't ask. She didn't lie. That afternoon, she sat by the window, curled up with a thick paperback from David's bookshelf. She devoured the pages like someone starved for words. "I forgot how much I missed reading," she murmured. "You're welcome to any book here," he replied, "even the ones with coffee stains." She smiled, then asked, "How did you end up working in a library?" David leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs. "My mom used to bring me to the library every weekend. It was our thing, even when we couldn't afford much else." Emma looked up. He continued, "She passed away when I was 16. After that, I guess, books became the only place I could still hear her voice." Emma said nothing, just watched him with eyes that no longer looked guarded. "That's her," he added quietly, nodding toward a small photo frame on the shelf. Inside was a black and white picture of a woman in a bookstore, laughing at something just outside the frame. Emma rose, walked over, and picked up the frame gently. Her fingers lingered on the glass. "She looks kind," she whispered. "She was," David said. "Kind, stubborn, too good for the life she had." Emma stared at the photo. Her breath caught. She blinked hard, and for the first time since David had met her, her composure cracked. Not from fear, not from pressure, but from something deeper. Her voice wavered. "No one has ever spoken about their mother like that in front of me." David frowned slightly, concerned. "Hey, are you okay?" But she was already turning away, eyes brimming with tears she couldn't stop. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pressing the back of her hand to her mouth. David crossed the room in 2 steps. He didn't touch her, only stood near. "You don't have to be sorry." "I don't cry," she said through trembling lips. "Not for me. Not like this." He waited, and then the tears came. Not violent or dramatic, just quiet, aching sobs that shook her shoulders. David handed her a tissue without a word. She took it gratefully, sitting on the edge of the couch as if she was afraid to let herself collapse. When she finally looked up, her cheeks were damp, but her eyes were clearer. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For not asking questions I can't answer." He gave her a tired but sincere smile. "Sometimes people don't need answers. They just need space." Emma looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, and in that moment she realized something she had never thought she would feel in the middle of a storm, inside a stranger's back room, wearing someone else's sweater. The next Saturday, the sky was overcast but calm, thick clouds hanging low, promising rain but holding off. David glanced at the weather app on his phone and shrugged. Could be worse. Emma stood in the doorway, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Where are we going?" "You'll see," he said with a small grin. "It's not fancy." "I don't need fancy," she replied, then added with a hesitant smile. "Not anymore." They walked side by side through narrow streets until they reached a busy corner tucked between rows of old brownstones. Music played from a crackling speaker nearby, and the scent of sizzling onions and fried dough filled the air. Emma's eyes widened as she took in the sight before her. A small weekend flea market, lined with tents in mismatched colors, tables covered in everything from vintage books to hand-knit scarves to chipped porcelain figurines. Children ran past with sticky fingers. A dog barked happily beside a stand selling roasted corn. There were no designer shoes or velvet ropes here. Just people, living. David bought 2 steaming cups of chai tea from a stand run by an older woman who greeted him by name. "She knows you?" Emma asked, amused. "I used to help her carry her boxes when I was a teenager," he replied, handing her a cup. "She makes the best tea in the city." Emma took a sip and blinked. "You're not wrong." They walked slowly, stopping to look at odd little treasures. Emma picked up a tiny brass elephant and turned it over in her palm. "My mother would never let me come to places like this," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Too dirty, too dangerous, too ordinary." "You don't seem like the type who'd mind ordinary," David said gently. Emma shook her head. "I think I've been looking for it all my life." They shared fried dumplings from a food cart, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath a string of colorful lanterns. Emma licked sauce from her thumb, laughing when David handed her a napkin with mock seriousness. As they neared the end of the market, the first drop of rain hit Emma's cheek. She looked up. "We might want to find cover," David said, already scanning the storefronts nearby. They ducked beneath the awning of a closed bakery just as the rain began to fall in earnest. The world softened in the mist, the sound of laughter muffled, the market crowd scattering, vendors covering their wares. They stood in the quiet, side by side, steam rising from the remnants of their tea. Emma crossed her arms, shivering slightly. David, without a word, shrugged off his jacket and placed it gently over her shoulders. "You'll get cold," she protested softly. "I'll live," he said with a smile. She looked at him, truly looked, her eyes darker in the gray light. "You're not like anyone I've ever met." David raised an eyebrow. "Is that a good thing?" "It's a real thing," she said. "You're kind. But not because you want something. You're just kind." He leaned against the wall beside her. "Shouldn't that be normal?" "It should," she whispered, "but it's not." She held the edges of his jacket closer, inhaling the faint scent of soap and old paper. Then, after a long pause, she said something so quietly he almost missed it. "You're the first person who hasn't asked me where I came from." He turned to her slowly. "Because I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." Emma blinked fast, as if she didn't trust the warmth blooming in her chest. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she leaned her head against the brick wall, looking out at the rain. "I used to think freedom meant being anywhere but home," she said. "Now I think maybe it's just being somewhere you don't have to explain yourself." David looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "You don't owe anyone an explanation." The rain eased into a gentle drizzle, and the light around them turned silver. She turned to him, her voice barely more than breath. "Do you really mean that?" "I wouldn't say it if I didn't." She smiled then, small, quiet, but real, the kind that doesn't just reach the lips, but warms something buried deep. And in that fleeting moment, under the soft rain and the flickering lights of a closing market, Emma felt something she had long forgotten. The first stirrings of home. The following week brought the first real sunlight in days. Emma, hood pulled low over her face, walked through the corner market with a canvas tote in hand. She moved quickly, trying not to draw attention. Grocery shopping was a small task, something ordinary, but for her it still felt like walking a tightrope. David had asked if she needed anything before leaving for the library that morning. She told him she was fine, and she had meant it, until she saw her own face on a newspaper stand outside the deli. Missing, Emma Lancaster, 25. Heiress to the Lancaster Holdings empire. Family offers. Reward for information. The photo was old, an image from a gala where she wore a silver gown and a smile that never reached her eyes. But it was unmistakably her. A woman exiting the deli glanced at the newspaper, then at Emma. Her eyes narrowed. Emma turned quickly, heart hammering, and walked away. Fast. She didn't stop until she was back at David's apartment. The key slipped in her hand, her vision blurred. She barely made it through the door before her knees buckled. She couldn't breathe. They knew. They were looking. And someone had seen her. She had brought danger to the only person who had shown her kindness without conditions. The decision came like instinct. She had to leave. By the time David returned from work, Emma had packed half of her things into a duffel. The books she had borrowed were stacked neatly on the table. A small note sat beside them, unfinished. He entered quietly, pausing when he saw her standing by the window, clutching the strap of her bag. He didn't speak at first, just watched her. Her hands trembled. "Where are you going?" he asked finally, voice calm. She froze. Her voice broke. "I have to." He stepped closer. "Why?" "I can't explain." He shook his head. "Try." She turned toward him, eyes shining with tears she had been holding back all afternoon. "Because they're looking for me. Because I don't belong here. Because you don't know who I really am." David was silent, his expression unreadable. Emma dropped her bag, took a shaky breath and whispered, "Because I'm afraid that when you find out you'll look at me differently." David's brows drew together. "Emma?" She looked away, her voice cracking. "My name is Emma Lancaster." The name hung in the air like thunder. David exhaled slowly. He had suspected, but hearing it from her lips changed everything. She waited for judgment, for anger, for him to step back, but he didn't move. "I know who the Lancasters are," he said finally. "I also know that doesn't change what you did for this place, what you've meant to me." Emma's eyes widened. "You're not angry." "I'm confused," he admitted, "but not angry." Her shoulders slumped, then tears spilled freely. "I didn't want to lie, I've never had anyone be kind to me without wanting something in return, and I didn't want that to end." David stepped forward, gently lifting her chin. "So you were afraid I'd stop seeing you the same way." She nodded, lips trembling. "And now?" "Now I'm afraid I've already ruined everything." He reached for her hand. "You haven't." Emma looked into his eyes, vulnerable, stripped of everything she once used to protect herself. "I'm scared, David. I'm scared because, for the first time, I care what someone thinks of me. I care about you." His hand squeezed hers gently. "Then don't run." And in the quiet that followed, as the last light of day bled across the windowsill, she let herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe she didn't have to. The kettle whistled softly in the background, but neither of them moved. Emma sat at the edge of the worn sofa, her fingers laced tightly together in her lap. David stood across the room, leaning against the counter, arms folded, jaw tense. "I should have told you sooner," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David didn't answer right away. The silence between them was different now, not comfortable like before, but heavy, thick with all the things neither of them knew how to say. Emma looked up slowly, searching his face for something, understanding, forgiveness, anything but the distance she felt growing between them. "My real name is Emma Grace Lancaster," she said. "Only daughter of Charles Lancaster, CEO of Lancaster Holdings." David blinked slowly, absorbing what he already suspected but had never fully allowed himself to believe. He nodded once, but his expression didn't change. "They want me to marry a man named Andrew Whitmore," she continued. "It's a merger disguised as a wedding, contracts instead of vows. My father thinks it will secure billions." David's brows drew together, but he didn't interrupt. "I never loved him. I never even chose him," she said. "The engagement was announced without my consent, and when I objected, they made it clear I didn't have a choice." Her voice broke then, and she looked down at her hands. "So I ran." He took a step toward her, then stopped. "You don't owe me an apology," he said gently. Emma looked up, surprised. "But I need to be honest with you too," David added. "I'm not angry. I'm trying to understand." She nodded slowly. "I'm not part of your world, Emma," he said. "I shelve books. I live paycheck to paycheck. I've spent most of my life trying to feel like enough for anyone, and most days I still don't." Her throat tightened. "I'm not afraid of where you come from," David said quietly. "I'm afraid that someday you'll go back to it, and when you do, there won't be room for someone like me." Emma stood then, eyes filled with something fierce and raw. "You think I want to go back to that life?" "I don't know," he said. "But I've seen what it does to people, and I've seen what it does to love." She took a step closer. "David, I've been surrounded by people who had everything, money, power, prestige, and they were still empty. And then I met you." He didn't speak. "You gave me a couch to sleep on when I was a stranger, in the rain. You shared your books, your stories, your quiet. And you never once asked me to be anyone other than myself." Her voice broke. "You are the first person who saw me. Not the name, not the legacy, just me." David's expression softened, but he still held himself back. Emma took another step forward. "I'm not asking you to change who you are. I love who you are." His eyes widened slightly, caught off guard. "I don't know what happens next," she whispered, "but I know I don't want to face it alone. I just want to live one life, one that I choose. And if I still believe in love after everything, it's because of you." David swallowed hard, emotion catching in his throat. For a moment they just stood there. Two people from opposite worlds, suspended in the fragile space between fear and hope. Then he reached for her hand. "You said you don't want to go back," he said. "So don't." Emma's eyes shimmered. He stepped closer. "Stay here. Stay with me. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and nodded. David pulled her gently into his arms, and for the first time in days, the tension melted from her shoulders. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. It didn't matter that the world outside was loud and complicated. Here, in this tiny apartment above a laundromat, in the arms of someone who saw her clearly, Emma felt something she had always longed for. Freedom. Not from people or places, but freedom to love and be loved back. The duffel bag sat by the door, half-zipped and ready. The plan was simple. Leave before sunrise, take the train north, disappear into a quieter place. A friend of David's had a cabin 2 towns over, secluded, safe. Not forever, but long enough to think, to breathe, to decide their next step. Emma stood by the window, her fingers twitching with nervous energy. She had never felt so free, or so terrified. David came in from the hallway, still in his library jacket, and gave her a reassuring smile. "Train leaves in 45 minutes. You sure about this?" She nodded. "I'm sure. I've never been more sure. But freedom has a way of slipping through your fingers the moment you begin to trust it." They didn't see the black SUV until it screeched to a halt beside the curb. Doors flung open. Men in suits poured out, familiar faces Emma had hoped she'd never see again. "Run!" David shouted, grabbing her hand. They sprinted down the alley behind the laundromat, weaving through puddles and trash bins. But the men were faster, trained. David pushed Emma ahead. "Go through the fence," he shouted. "Cut through the bakery's loading dock." Emma turned to argue, but in that second one of the men caught up. Another lunged at David, shoving him hard against the alley wall. His head cracked against the brick. He crumpled, blood mingling with the rain. "David!" Emma screamed, trying to reach him. 2 arms wrapped around her from behind, pulling her away. "No, no, let me go! David!" He lay motionless, and her voice broke into sobs. She kicked and thrashed, but it was useless. The men loaded her into the SUV, slammed the door, and sped off into the night. The mansion was too bright, too clean, too cold. They stripped her of the clothes she had worn, clothes that still smelled like David's jacket, and replaced them with silk and lace. They confiscated her phone, her laptop, even the small bracelet David had given her at the flea market, saying it looked like her, imperfect but real. For days, Emma cried. She begged to know if David was alive. No one told her anything. She sat by her bedroom window, staring out across the trimmed hedges and fountains, but all she could see was his blood on the alley bricks. Her mother visited once, placed a firm hand on her shoulder and said coldly, "You will marry Andrew. You'll smile, and this family will be done with scandal." Emma said nothing. What could she say? She was trapped in the very castle she had once been taught to call home. The date was set. The guest list finalized. The dress fitted. She stood like a ghost in front of the mirror, makeup covering the hollows under her eyes. Her hair curled, pinned into the perfect updo. But nothing could hide the emptiness in her expression. Inside she was screaming. Outside she smiled for the cameras. And when the priest asked if she took Andrew Whitmore to be her lawfully wedded husband, her mouth opened, and a single breath caught in her chest. Her eyes darted to the crowd. David was nowhere to be seen, so she whispered the only word she could, "Yes." The ballroom shimmered with gold. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead. Dozens of cameras flashed as Emma Lancaster stood at the altar, dressed in ivory silk and silence. Her hands trembled inside lace gloves. Her eyes, though painted perfectly, were dull. She stared straight ahead at the officiant, not the man beside her. Andrew Whitmore, polished and proud, stood tall in his tailored tuxedo, his smile stiff and rehearsed. The room buzzed with quiet anticipation. Business tycoons, politicians, and celebrities seated in velvet rows, murmuring beneath breath. The union of two empires, the marriage of wealth and power. But Emma heard none of it. Only the echo of her heartbeat and the ghost of a voice in her mind. "Run," he had said. She had not seen David since the alley. She didn't even know if he was alive. She only knew she had dreamed of his eyes every night since. The officiant cleared his throat. "We gather today to witness the joining of two souls." Emma barely breathed. He continued reading, voice echoing off marble walls. Then, just as he raised the final line, "If anyone here has reason this union should not proceed, speak now or—" The back doors slammed open. A collective gasp rippled through the room as a figure stepped inside, soaked from the rain, clothes wrinkled, a thin bandage above one brow, a split lip, and eyes locked only on her. David. Emma's breath caught. Her hands flew to her mouth. He walked with a slight limp, but his steps were steady, purposeful. And he never looked away from her, not for a second. Andrew stepped forward, fuming. "Who the hell let him in?" Guards moved. Too late. Emma was already running. She tore down the aisle, veil flying behind her, eyes filled with tears that finally fell freely. She reached David and flung her arms around him, sobbing against his chest. He caught her, held her as if she might vanish again. "You're alive," she whispered, voice shaking. "You're really here." "I told you," he said, holding her tighter. "I'd find you." Cameras snapped. Journalists shouted. The crowd erupted. Someone called for security, but neither of them moved. They turned together to face the room, hands still clasped. A reporter pushed forward, microphone raised. "Mr. Carter, what are you doing here? This is a private event." David's voice was hoarse but clear. "I'm here because the woman I love is being forced into something she never chose." More flashes. Murmurs turned into noise. "She's not running from a marriage," David said. "She's running toward freedom." Another voice barked from the front row, Charles Lancaster himself. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Step away from my daughter before this becomes a legal matter." Emma stepped forward, her voice steady. "I'm not your business deal. I'm not your investment. I'm your daughter." Her father paled. Her mother looked away. David squeezed her hand gently. Then, in front of hundreds, he turned to Emma and said the words no one expected. "She doesn't belong in my world. I know that. I shelve books. I live in a studio above a laundromat. And she comes from palaces, from power, from everything I'll never touch." He looked at the cameras, then back at her. "But none of that matters, because she's not part of my world. She is my world." The room went silent. Emma's throat closed, but she forced herself to speak. "If I have to choose between diamonds and dinner tables, between legacy and love," she turned to David, "I choose the man who held my hand in the rain when I had nothing." Her mother's hand trembled on the pew. Her father rose, booming, "If you walk out that door with him, you are no longer a Lancaster." Emma turned, heart thudding. "I don't need to be a Lancaster," she said. "I just need to be me." She grabbed David's hand. Together they turned, and without a backward glance they walked, ran down the aisle, pushing through the grand doors into the storm outside. The rain welcomed them like an old friend, and this time they didn't run to escape. They ran to live. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind them as Emma and David burst into the storm. Rain poured in sheets, soaking them within seconds, but neither of them slowed. Emma kicked off her heels mid-step, grabbed the hem of her gown, and ran barefoot down the marble steps. David laughed, a sound deep and full, and she laughed too, breathless and wild, her hand gripping his like a lifeline. They ran past valets, stunned security guards, confused wedding guests, through puddles and reflections of a life she had just walked away from. the world around them blurred with motion and rain, but between their joined hands, everything felt clear. At the corner of the empty plaza, David paused, pulling her into the circle of his arms. "You're soaked," he said, brushing wet strands of hair from her face. "I don't care," she whispered, eyes glowing through the raindrops. He smiled, tucking a piece of her veil behind her ear. "Where do we go now?" Emma tilted her head back, laughing into the sky. Then she shouted at the top of her lungs, voice echoing into the storm. "I'm not a princess anymore. I'm me, and I choose you." David stared at her, stunned. Then he kissed her right there, in the middle of the street beneath a sky weeping with joy, while the city roared around them. It was messy and wet and perfect. A kiss not of fairy tales, but of two real people who had fought for their right to love. 2 years later, the town of Belridge, nestled among rolling hills and flower-lined fences, had quietly welcomed a new couple and their little boy into its gentle rhythm. The bell above the door of Theo's corner bookshop jingled as Emma wiped down the front window, humming along to the jazz record playing from the back room. Sunlight poured in, catching dust motes in the air, and from the children's corner came a familiar voice. David sat cross-legged on a rug, reading aloud from a picture book, his hair slightly grayer at the temples, his voice full of warmth. "And then the bear said, 'No matter where we go, home is where the heart is,'" he read, glancing up at the little boy in his lap. Theo, barely 2 and already with his mother's eyes and his father's curiosity, clapped his chubby hands and pointed at the pictures. "Bear, go home!" "That's right," David said, kissing the top of his head. Emma leaned against the doorframe, her heart so full it hurt. There were no security gates here, no press conferences, just books, laughter, and the smell of cinnamon rolls from the bakery next door. Their life was simple, but every corner of it was theirs. A knock came at the door. Emma turned, surprised to see a familiar black town car parked outside. From it stepped 2 figures, her parents. Charles Lancaster stood a few feet behind his wife, his expression unreadable. Her mother, elegantly dressed as always, held a small bouquet of daisies. Emma froze, heart racing. David looked up, eyes meeting hers across the shop. He stood slowly, Theo still in his arms. Her mother approached first, tentative. We thought we'd stop by, if that's all right." Emma swallowed hard, nodding. "Of course." Her mother handed her the flowers without a word, then leaned down to look at Theo. "And this must be the famous Theo." Theo, ever friendly, reached out a hand. "Hi." A laugh bubbled up in Emma's chest, soft, unsure. Then her father stepped forward. He looked older somehow, not defeated but quieter. He stared at Theo for a long moment before slowly kneeling down and reaching out his arms. "May I?" he asked. Emma hesitated, then nodded. David gently passed Theo over. Charles Lancaster, the man who once valued image over everything, held his grandson like he was the most fragile, most priceless thing in the world. For a long time he said nothing. Then, softly, his voice breaking in a way Emma had never heard before, he murmured, "He looks like you." Emma's eyes filled with tears, not because she needed their approval, but because sometimes love has a way of finding its way home, even when it starts with a storm. And in that little bookstore, where every page whispered of possibility, Emma finally understood. She hadn't just found freedom that night in the rain, she had found everything. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment of this heartfelt journey. If you've ever felt out of place in a world that demands perfection, if you've ever longed for a love that asks for nothing but your true self, then the story of Emma and David is a gentle reminder. Real love is not defined by status, legacy, or wealth. It's found where your heart is seen, heard, and held. They crossed boundaries, defied expectations, and chose each other, not for what they had, but for who they were. In the rain, through the fear, and into freedom, they found not just love, but home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more emotional, soul-healing tales like this one. We'll see you in the next story, where love doesn't need to be perfect to be true, and where every moment has the power to change everything.